The gate in the Teartha airport was alive with the restless rhythm of travel bodies moving in every direction, voices overlapping in hurried tones, the smell of roasted coffee mixing with the sharp scent of jet fuel drifting in from the runways. The giant glass windows shimmered with the reflection of morning light, while announcements rolled over the speakers, like steady waves telling passengers where to go and who was boarding next. In the middle of that restless energy, a woman stood, gripping a ticket that meant more than a seat. It meant a dream fulfilled. Her name was Denise, a black mother who had saved for years for this flight to attend something that mattered to her future and her family. She had pressed her clothes carefully. The night before she had packed with a trembling sense of pride, and when she held that first-class ticket in her hand, it was not just a piece of paper but a badge of hard work, dignity and long sacrifice. She stepped toward the gate with her heart rising in her chest, her young son waiting at home, believing in her, believing that his mother could reach heights no one thought she could. The gate was crowded with businessmen in pressed suits, women with polished hair, children clinging to parents, and students clutching backpacks. Denise tried to hold herself tall as she entered the line, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted her purse. A man behind her muttered something under his breath, not loud enough for her to catch the full words but loud enough to know it was not kindness. She ignored him, as she had ignored many before, because today was not the day to let the world steal her light. When she reached the counter, the gate agent looked at her with eyes that held no warmth. The woman behind the desk had a sharpness to her tone, a rigid mask of authority that was less about procedure and more about power. Denise greeted her with quiet respect, offering the ticket with careful hands. The agent glanced down at it, then back up at her face, as though the paper could not possibly belong to the woman standing before her. The seconds stretched heavy. Denise's throat tightened, but she did not let her eyes drop. Their agent's lips curled slightly, and with emotion that seemed almost rehearsed, she tore the ticket in half. The sound of the rip was louder than the surrounding voices, sharper than the overhead announcements. It cut through the air and through Denise's chest, leaving her breathless and still. For a moment she could not move, could not even blink, as the pieces of her first-class ticket fell into the trash behind the counter. A hush fell over those who saw it. Then whispers began moving like a current through the crowd. Some laughed quietly, some shook their heads, some leaned closer to watch, as though the humiliation of one woman could serve as entertainment for many. Denise felt her hands grow cold, her knees weaken, but she straightened her back, refusing to let her body collapse in front of them. She swallowed against the burning in her throat, her eyes stinging, yet she kept them fixed forward, refusing to cry, refusing to let the crowd see her break. The gate agent spoke again, her voice smooth but laced with disdain, telling Denise that her seat had been changed, that there must have been some mistake, that she no longer belonged where she thought she did. The words carried weight, designed to wound, to remind her of a place society expected her to remain in. But Denise heard something else in that voice. She heard the echo of every struggle, every door slammed in her face, every time she had to work twice as hard for half the chance. The sting was familiar, but the wound was fresh. The crowd behind her began to shift, restless, with the drama unfolding. Some smirked, enjoying the spectacle. Others lowered their eyes, perhaps ashamed to watch, yet unwilling to intervene. A young couple whispered to one another, and a man in a grey suit chuckled under his breath, as though her pain was a comedy meant for him. Denise clenched her hands around the strap of her purse, drawing breath into her lungs, steadying herself against the storm swirling around her heart. She thought of her son and the promise she had made to him. She thought of the nights spent working overtime, cleaning offices while others slept. She thought of the mornings she woke before dawn to catch buses that carried her across the city, so she could put food on the table and hope in her child's eyes. That ticket was not a luxury, it was a symbol of all those battles fought in silence. And yet, here, in a single cruel moment, it had been ripped apart. The gate agent dismissed her with a wave, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience to be moved along. But Denise did not move. She stood there in the bright light of the terminal, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She could feel every eye on her, feel the heat of their stares and the weight of their judgment. She knew if she turned and walked away now, she would carry this humiliation with her like a scar, etched deep into her spirit. For a long breath, she did nothing. Then, slowly, she leaned forward, her voice, low but steady, asking the agent to explain to her exactly why her ticket had been torn. The woman behind the desk shifted, slightly uncomfortable for the first time, but quickly masked it with a clipped reply. She claimed the system had reassigned. The seat claimed Denise must have misunderstood, claimed rules were rules. and nothing could be done. The crowd leaned in closer to hear, but Denise heard only the pounding of her heart echoing in her ears. She stepped back from the counter, the air heavy around her. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, fighting the urge to collapse into despair, fighting the urge to shout or to weep. Instead, she turned slightly away, gripping her phone in her hand as if it were an anchor. Her fingers hovered over the screen, trembling. She did not know why, but she felt the urge to call someone, anyone, though she had not yet decided who. The whispers swirled around her like smoke, thick and suffocating, but within the haze, a flicker of something stirred. Not anger, not yet, but the sharp edge of resolve. The gate remained open. Announcements continued to call names. The world moved on, as if her pain were nothing more than another scene in the endless play of travel. Yet Denise knew deep within her soul that something had been set in motion. She did not know what form it would take, but she could feel it in the marrow of her bones. The tearing of her ticket was not the end. It was the beginning of something she could not yet see. And as she stood in that crowded airport, with the pieces of her dignity scattered like paper behind the counter, her phone began to vibrate in her hand, the screen glowing with an incoming call. Whispers and eyes watching the call lit up the phone in her hand, but for a moment Denise did not answer. She only stared at the glowing screen, while the voices around her grew sharper in her ears. Some whispered her name, others did not know it, but all of them were building their own stories about her. In the silence that followed the tearing of her ticket, a woman in a red coat leaned toward her husband, murmuring that this was what happened when people tried to rise above their place, while another man shook his head and muttered that it was a shame. Though he did not step forward to say it to her face, Denise could feel the weight of every eye pressing against her skin, some hard with judgment, others soft with sympathy, but none of them offering a hand. She heard laughter like faint knives cutting through her back as she turned slightly away from the counter, clutching her phone close to her chest. Her chest rose and fell with the rhythm of someone holding in storm, clouds holding in tears that threatened to break like thunder. Yet she would not give them the show they wanted. She would not fall to her knees and give them the satisfaction of seeing her shattered. The gate agent sat taller in her chair, pretending to move on to the next passenger, her fingers clicking against the keyboard, her mouth curling in the faintest trace of a smile, as if the matter had been settled, as if Denise had been erased from the moment a businessman stepped forward with his ticket, his voice booming over Denise, as though she were invisible. She stepped aside just enough to not block the line, but not enough to disappear entirely, and in that half space she became the center of whispers, the subject of darting glances. The figure, painted with rheum at the phone, continued to vibrate, her hand trembling as she lifted it closer to her ear. She pressed answer, but no words came, yet the voice on the other side was firm, calm, steady, calling her name with familiarity. Denise, Denise, is that you? Her lips parted, her voice catching in her throat as she breathed. Yes, and in that moment the world around her seemed to pause, not because the crowd grew silent, but because the words flowing from the other end seemed to carve through the noise with authority. She listened as the caller explained who they were, a voice tied to a past moment in her life, a voice she had not expected today. They told her to remain calm, to not walk away, to not believe for a moment that the humiliation she had endured was the end of her journey. The crowd around her could not hear the words, but they could see her face shifting from despair into something else, something steadier, something the gate agent noticed out of the corner of her eye. The agent typed slower, her shoulders tightening, though her eyes did not dare rise to meet Denise again. Round them, the whispers deepened. A teenage boy leaned against a pillar, recording the scene on his phone, while his friend muttered that this would go viral. A woman with a stroller shook her head in quiet anger, whispering to no one in particular that this was not right. This chorus of voices blended with the overhead calls for boarding zones and the rolling wheels of suitcases, until the entire terminal felt like a theater, and Denise stood at the center stage. The mother thought of her son again, his small face pressed against the window that morning when he had waved her goodbye, his voice telling her that she deserved everything good in this world. She thought of the strength she had borrowed from him just to step on this journey, and now she felt that strength returning like a tide rising in her chest. She clutched the phone tighter, listening carefully to the words spilling through it, words that carried promises of justice, and words that carried warnings that she was not alone. She closed her eyes for a breath, letting the sound anchor her, letting the shame that had been forced upon her melt into something sharper. The crowd shifted again, a man in uniform walking past, pausing for a moment, as though deciding whether to ask what was happening but moving on when he saw no clear reason to interfere. Some passengers smirked, still enjoying the theater, while others avoided, her eyes afraid that even sharing her gaze would draw them into the storm. Denise opened her eyes again, scanning the faces, and for the first time she noticed something in the crowd. A few people were not laughing, were not mocking. They were watching with intent eyes, steady and searching, as if waiting for her to make the next move. The whispers now felt different, no longer just a current of mockery, but a wave of anticipation. The boy with the phone whispered to his friend that she looked like she was about to do something that would change the whole game. The friend laughed, but kept recording. The couple in the corner leaned closer, as though they wanted to be the first to understand the story unfolding before them. The gate agent pretended to check another ticket, but her eyes flicked upward, now uneasy, as if she felt the eyes of the crowd turning against her without words being spoken. Dana stepped forward slightly, her voice still quiet, but no longer trembling, as she asked once more why her ticket had been destroyed. She did not raise her tone, she did not cry, she only let the strength of her steady words cut through the space. The agent muttered again about policy, about systems, about reassigned seats. But now her words carried less power. Now they sounded brittle as the watching crowd leaned closer. Denise lowered the phone for a moment, holding it by her side, but she could still hear the faint voice speaking instructions, telling her to remain strong, telling her that the truth was already moving toward her. She looked at the gate agent and then at the crowd, her chest rising higher with each breath. She realized she was no longer just a woman humiliated at a counter. She was the focus of every watching eye. The figure, every whisper, was about to circle around Daychild. Asked her mother loudly why that lady's ticket was taken away, and the mother hushed her but could not stop the flush of shame spreading across her own face as she realized what her daughter had witnessed. An old man shook his head, muttering that he had seen enough of this in his life, that nothing ever changed, but even his voice carried less certainty than before. Denise heard them all. She felt their judgment and their pity, but now she also felt their uncertainty. She was not just enduring their gaze, she was shaping it. The voice on the phone grew firmer, telling her that what had been done to her was unlawful, telling her that eyes were on this moment, that she would not be left to face it alone. She lifted the phone back to her ear, whispering that she understood, whispering that she would hold on until they arrived. Her voice was low enough that only those nearest could catch fragments, and those fragments only deepened the mystery of who she was and what was about to happen. The gate agent shifted again, typing slower, clearing her throat, telling the next passenger to step forward, but the rhythm of her authority had faltered. Her voice no longer rang with the same power. Her hand trembled slightly as she handed back a boarding pass. Her mask was cracking in the face of a silence that was no longer submission but suspense. Denise stood tall, her phone pressed close, her eyes forward, and though her heart still carried the wound of the torn ticket, her spirit had begun to blaze in a new fire. The whispers were no longer cutting her down, they were feeding her resolve. She was no longer a victim trapped in the cruel theater. She was becoming the center of a story none of them could predict, and as the crowd watched her every movement, waiting for what would come next, the phone in her hand delivered words that would carry her into the next moment, words that promised the tide was about to turn. A call in the noise, the sound of the phone pressed to her ear was like a rope pulling her out of the water, as the voice on the other end spoke with calm assurance. It was not the voice of a stranger, and that recognition washed over her in waves. She knew this tone, though she had not expected to hear it. Now, not in the middle of an airport with strangers staring at her and humiliation clinging to her skin. The voice carried weight, firm and measured, and it called her name with quiet strength, as though reminding her of who she truly was. Denise felt the sting in her chest ease just slightly as she whispered back, barely moving her lips. She asked why they were calling her now, how they knew what had just happened. The voice told her to listen, not to ask too many questions, yet that everything happening had already reached the right ears. The crowd did not hear the words, but they saw the shift in her face. They saw how her posture grew taller and her eyes sharpened. And though no one could understand what was being said, it sent a ripple through the gathering like the tremor before a storm. The agent behind the counter noticed too, and for the first time her own certainty seemed to falter. She glanced at the phone in Denise's hand, her fingers pausing over the keyboard, as though sensing this call was not one she wanted to compete with. Yet she tried to cover her unease with the same mask of indifference, calling another passenger forward, as if routine could shield her from what was coming. But even her movements were slower. now each word spoken with less authority, because the balance of power was no longer settled. The voice continued to flow into Denise's ear, telling her details she had not expected, reminding her of past connections and legal matters that had been filed in her name months ago, matters that were still active and carried weight. The voice said her humiliation would not go unanswered, that the tearing of her ticket had crossed a line that would now trigger more than the agent had ever imagined. Denise's heart pounded louder with every word, her breath shaking, not from weakness but from the realization that she was no longer powerless. Around her, the noise of the airport seemed to grow louder, children crying, families rushing to gates, announcements booming from overhead, yet inside her chest the noise was drowned out by the steady clarity of the voice guiding her. The boy, still recording, lifted his phone higher, whispering that this was getting better by the minute, that something was about to explode. A woman nearby hushed him but leaned closer all the same, because she too wanted to know who was speaking on the other end of the call that could change a woman's face from despair into fire. Denise asked softly what she should do now, whether she should walk away or stand her ground. The voice told her not to move, not to retreat even one step back from where she stood. They said the situation was already under review, that even now eyes beyond the terminal were watching. The recording that was spreading, the young boy had posted his video within moments, and already it had begun its journey into the digital world, and the voice confirmed that this wave was not going to be contained. The humiliation she had felt was real, but it was also evidence, it was proof, it was power now turned against the very hand that had tried to crush her. The gate agent cleared her throat, impatient with the silence. She told Denise again that the matter was closed, that she could not stand in the way forever, and that she needed to leave the line. Denise lifted her eyes slowly, and for the first time she did not lower them. She looked directly at the woman behind the desk, her gaze steady and unflinching. The agent shifted uncomfortably under the weight of those eyes, glancing toward the line of passengers as if seeking support. But what she found instead were faces watching with narrowed stares, not all sympathetic, but none blind to the injustice. Denise's hand tightened on the phone as the voice reminded her of the strength she carried and the rights she possessed. The shame that had nearly broken her minutes ago now twisted into resolve. She whispered her agreement, promising she would hold steady until whoever was speaking arrived, or until the tide turned in her favor. Her lips curved slightly in the faintest hint of defiance, the kind born from pain reshaped into armor. The whispers around her grew louder again, questions swirling through the crowd about who she was and what kind of call she was taking. A man asked aloud if she was talking to a lawyer, and another laughed, saying maybe it was her husband, telling her to come home. But the laugh rang hollow, because deep down they all felt the gravity in the air. The teenage boy updated his post, muttering that people online were already commenting that the situation looked bad for the airline. That ripple of truth spread like unseen fire across the room, shifting the whispers into a hum of tension. Denise closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the stares and the noise, letting the voice guide her forward. She thought of her son again, his eyes bright when she had left, his smile telling her she could face anything. She thought of her late mother, who had told her years ago that there would be days when the world tried to tear her down simply for daring to stand tall, and that on those days she would need to summon a strength deeper than tears. She thought of every sacrifice etched into her journey, and in that moment she knew she was standing at the edge of something greater than humiliation. She was standing at the beginning of her own vindication. The agent spoke again, louder this time, saying she was holding up the line, that she needed to move, but her voice no longer had the same cut. It wavered just slightly, betraying the unease beneath her forced authority, and that tremor did not go unnoticed by those watching. Some passengers exchanged looks, their own whispers shifting from amusement to discomfort. Some even muttered that the woman behind the desk had gone too far, that maybe the ticket should never have been torn in the first place. The current of opinion was shifting under the agent's feet, and she felt it. Denise lifted the phone back to her ear, hearing the voice instruct her that help was on the way, that she must not let go of her ground. No matter how many eyes pressed on her, she nodded slowly, even though the caller could not see her, her heart thundering with the promise of what was to come. Her humiliation was no longer just hers. It was being witnessed, it was being recorded, it was being transformed into evidence. Her breathing steadied her shoulders, squared her eyes, no longer shone with suppressed tears, but with something sharper. The whispers continued. The crowd leaned closer. The boy's phone kept recording, and the agent fidgeted behind the counter, tapping her fingers against the keyboard with restless unease. Denise spoke no more words aloud, only listened as the voice in her ear promised the storm was about to break, and it would not be her who was swept away. In that crowded terminal where laughter had moments ago been at her expense, there now lingered a silence woven with suspense as every eye waited to see what would happen when the call ended. Truth unveiled in silence. The call did not end, it deepened, each word from the other side landing like stone in still water, sending ripples through Denise's chest. The voice was steady, controlled, and carried the kind of authority that could not be faked. It was a lawyer, one she had spoken 2 months before, when matters of inheritance and contracts had been tangled in red tape. A lawyer tied to her late mother's case, a lawyer who had once promised that when the right time came, everything her mother had worked for would not be lost. The time had come now at this gate, where humiliation had met its stage, and witnesses stood to see justice rise. Denise listened, her heart racing not from fear but from the weight of revelation. She had expected nothing today but a flight to a conference, a chance to meet people who might open new doors for her family. Instead, she was being reminded that she was not walking empty-handed into this world that her mother had left behind. More than memories, more than struggles, she had left behind a claim that mattered in the eyes of law and in the world of power. The lawyer reminded her of papers already filed, of a trust long contested, and of the pending confirmation that would change her standing completely. The crowd could not hear the words, but they saw the change. The woman they thought broken now held herself as if roots had grown beneath her feet, anchoring her to something unshakable. Her lips no longer trembled, her eyes no longer darted away. The agent behind the counter shifted again, her posture stiff as she pretended to focus on other passengers, but her ears strained to catch even fragments of the hushed conversation. The laughter in the crowd had gone quiet, replaced with restless silence, curiosity binding them closer than sympathy. Ever had Denise lowered her phone just enough to meet the agent's gaze. Her silence spoke louder than any argument could. She did not need to raise her voice because the weight of her stare carried a storm. The agent blinked, breaking contact, shifting in her seat, her voice faltering as she told another traveler to move along quickly. Her mask of authority was thinning, the whispers around them thickening into suspicion. The young boy recording whispered to his friend that this looked like a movie playing out live, that the ending would shock everyone watching. The lawyer's voice pressed on, clear and relentless, explaining that the act of tearing her ticket was not just cruelty, but a violation of rights that went deeper than customer service. This act had been captured on camera, and the video was already in circulation. The agent thought she was erasing a woman from first class, but instead, she had exposed herself before thousands who were already watching. Denise's humiliation was evidence now, evidence that would travel faster than any flight, evidence that the law itself would soon hold in its hands. Denise closed her eyes, breathing through the storm inside her chest. She thought of her mother again, of the long nights spent listening to her stories of perseverance, of warnings that dignity must be held tight no matter how the world tried to rip it away. She felt her son's small hand in her memory clinging to hers as he told her to promise never to let anyone make her feel less. She had promised, and now she felt that promise ignite within her like a torch in darkness. She was not just holding a phone, she was holding the chain of every sacrifice that had brought her heroine. She opened her eyes again. The crowd felt the difference. The silence that spread through the boarding area was not emptiness, but anticipation, like the breath of an audience held before a revelation. The whispers had stopped being cruel. They had turned into guesses, into murmurs, about who she was and what power stood behind her. Now some spoke the word lawyer under their breath, others said maybe government. Some even wondered if she was someone famous traveling incognito. They all felt the tension, none could deny it. Agent finally broke the silence, snapping that Denise needed to leave the line, that holding a phone would not change the rules. Denise did not move. She stood steady, her eyes never wavering, her phone pressed close as the lawyer's words became sharper, telling her that they were already contacting the airline's legal department, telling her that statements were being prepared, telling her that she must remain calm because within moments everything would turn in her favor. The agent heard enough to know that the ground under her was slipping, and she bit her lip, though she tried to cover it with anger. Denise lowered the phone just enough to let her words cut through the silence. She said she was not moving. She said she would wait. Right here, she said she had been told help was coming, and she believed it. The words were not shouted yet. They landed in the air with a weight that silenced even the restless shuffling of the line. Every head turned fully toward her, now eyes wide, waiting for what those words meant. The agent's cheeks flushed with heat. Her authority no longer unquestioned, but cracking under the spotlight. Minutes stretched like hours, but Denise did not waver. She stood tall, her heart beating like a drum, yet her face calm. Her silence was more powerful than protest, her stillness more unsettling than rage. And then the moment shifted again. A murmur rose near the far end of the gate. A man in a dark suit stepped through the crowd, his badge glinting. Under the lights, the lawyer had sent someone, an associate already carrying documents, already prepared. His stride was confident, his face composed, and the crowd parted for him, as though instinctively, recognizing his authority. The gate agent's hands froze above the keyboard, her voice stuck in her throat. Denise felt her knees weaken at the sight, but she did not bend. She lifted her chin as the man approached her directly, his voice steady as he spoke her name, confirming it aloud, so the crowd could hear. The whispers surged again, louder this time, the sound of collective realization that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. The man glanced at her phone, nodded, and introduced himself as counsel, acting on behalf of the firm that had been handling her mother's case. The crowd gasped softly as he spoke, not because they understood the details, but because the tone left no room for doubt. This was no accident. This was no ordinary passenger. This woman was connected to something larger than the gate, than the flight, than the humiliation that had been inflicted upon her. The agent tried to interrupt, stammering about procedure and assignments, but the lawyer raised his hand. Silencing her with calm authority, he told her that tearing the ticket had been an unlawful act, that she had stripped away a rightful seat without cause, and that consequences would follow. Denise listened, her chest rising with every word, feeling the chains of humiliation break away piece by piece. The crowd leaned in closer, no longer mocking, now restless with awe. They whispered that they had seen history in small form. They whispered that the woman humiliated had turned into someone powerful. Before their eyes, the boy recording whispered that this video was going to break the internet. The gate agent lowered her eyes, her lips tightening but her face paling under the weight of truth, and in that silence, heavy and unbroken, the truth stood. Tall Denise was no longer just a woman robbed of her seat. She was a mother standing on the foundation her late mother had built, a woman tied to power and law, a woman no gate agent could erase. Her silence had unveiled more than words could have. And now the story was no longer humiliation, it was justice, waiting to land. The return, and the stare, the silence after the lawyer's words, stretched heavy across the terminal, and in that silence, Denise felt a shift so powerful, it was as if the ground beneath her feet had turned. The humiliation that had clung to her like chains was slipping away, replaced by the steady rise of dignity she thought had been torn with her ticket. She did not need to speak yet, because the presence of the man in the suit had spoken for her, and the crowd that once whispered with mockery, now whispered with Oshi, looked around slowly, letting her eyes meet those who stared at her. Some dropped their gaze, unable to hold the weight of what they had just witnessed, while others kept watching with the wide eyes of those who knew they would tell this story later to strangers and friends. The boy with the phone lowered his device for a moment, his face caught between guilt and amazement, whispering to his friend that this was bigger than anything he thought he was filming. His friend only nodded, his mouth open, his breath caught, because everyone could feel it. This was no longer a scene of shame, but a moment turning into history before their eyes. Denise turned back toward the gate agent, who sat frozen behind her counterfingers, stiff above the keyboard, eyes flicking nervously between the suited lawyer and the woman she had humiliated. Moments before, she had been the one with the power. She had torn the ticket with satisfaction and spoken with authority, but now, her lips pressed into a thin line, her throat tightening against words she could not find. The lawyer's presence loomed beside Denise, his calm voice filling the air as he spoke of rights and violations, his words carrying the weight of law and consequence. The agent attempted to answer, but her voice faltered. She spoke of procedure again, of systems and policy, but the words rang hollow in the air because everyone knew what had happened was not about procedure. It was about dignity, torn apart in public view and now exposed for what it truly was. The lawyer corrected her, each time his voice unwavering, his language sharp but respectful, cutting through excuses. Like a blade through silk, the crowd leaned in, some nodding, some shaking their heads, but all of them glued to the unfolding confrontation. Dennis drew a slow breath and stepped forward, not to speak over the lawyer, but to stand in her own place beside him. She felt her spine straighten, felt her chest rise, not in defiance, but in reclamation of everything she had been denied. She looked at the gate agent, and their eyes locked in a stare that felt like fire against stone. Denise's gaze was unflinching, calm, yet filled with the unspoken weight of every sacrifice that had led her here. And the agent flinched ever so slightly, as though struck by something invisible. Whispers grew again, rippling outward. A woman in the back whispered to her husband that she had never seen anyone stand so tall after being humiliated. A man in a grey suit who had laughed earlier shifted uncomfortably. Now his smirk gone, his face pale because he knew he had been on the wrong side of the moment. A child tugged on her mother's sleeve, asking why the lady was being treated differently now, and the mother whispered back that sometimes truth arrived late, but it always arrived. Denise heard these voices not as wounds, but as threads weaving into her strength. Lawyer leaned closer, telling Denise that statements were being drafted, that official action would follow, but in this moment her choice was clear. She could walk away with quiet dignity now, or she could hold the stare until the agent herself admitted fault. Denise's heart pounded, but her answer came without hesitation. She would not move, not until the woman who had torn her down faced the truth of what she had done. The lawyer nodded in approval, his eyes gleaming with respect for her resolve. The gate agent shifted in her chair, her cheeks flushed, her hands trembling, though she tried to hide it. She muttered words about moving the line, about passengers waiting, but no one moved forward, because the crowd was no longer interested in boarding. They were bound by the tension of this one confrontation, their flight temporarily forgotten. Their journey was no longer about reaching destinations. It was about watching justice unfold in the space between a mother and the woman who had tried to strip her of dignity. Denise inhaled deeply, her eyes never leaving the agent, and in that stare was the memory of her son, her mother. Every hardship she had endured to earn her place in the world. It was not just anger in her stare, it was the full force of a life lived in resistance against being diminished. The agent looked away for a moment, pretending to shuffle papers, but her hands betrayed her tremor. Her voice cracked as she tried to explain herself again, but the explanation dissolved under the gaze of Denise and the silence of the crowd, who were no longer convinced by excuses. A suited lawyer folded his arms, his expression calm but firm, and he said aloud, so the crowd could hear, that the airline would be contacted within minutes, that disciplinary measures would be demanded, that damages would be pursued. He said the act of tearing the ticket had not been an inconvenience. It had been a humiliation inflicted with intent, and that the law would not treat it lightly. The words were heavy enough to make the crowd murmur in agreement, some even nodding and saying yes under their breath. The agent shrank further into her chair, her power slipping through her fingers like sand. Denise took a step closer, her purse against her side, her phone still in her hand, though silent now. The boy with the phone recording whispered again that this video would make headlines, and his voice trembled not with excitement, but with disbelief at the magnitude of what he was capturing. Denise stood not for a headline, not for strangers watching through screens, but for herself, for her son, for her mother's memory. She stood because no one would ever again believe they could tear her down without consequence. Air in the terminal thickened, with silence broken only by the faint announcements overhead, calling other flights, voices that no one was listening to anymore. The world inside that gate was wrapped tightly around this single confrontation and the stare that had become the center of it all. Denise's eyes unwavering, the agent's face breaking, the lawyer's voice steady, and the crowd's breath held. And then Denise spoke softly but firmly, the first words she had chosen for herself since her ticket had been torn. She said she had done nothing wrong. She said she had earned her seat, and she said that what was taken from her was not just a piece of paper, but a piece of her dignity, torn without reason and without remorse. Her words were quiet, yet they struck the air like thunder, because the silence around her magnified every syllable. The crowd murmured louder, some clapping softly, some whispering that she was right. The agent lowered her eyes, unable to meet her gaze again, her voice weak as she said she was only following orders, but the weakness in her tone betrayed her fear. The lawyer corrected her again, reminding her and everyone listening that cruelty was not an order, it was a choice, and she had chosen it in front of witnesses. Her face burned red, her shoulders slumped, and for the first time since this began, she looked like the one who had been exposed and stripped bare. Denise felt the shift complete. She no longer felt the chains of humiliation pressing her down. She felt the strength of every eye that now looked at her with respect, or at the very least, with acknowledgement. She had taken back the power stolen from her, not by rage, but by endurance, by silence, and then by truth spoken clear. Her son would know when she told him. This story that his mother had not broken under shame, but had stood in the fire until the fire turned into light. The lawyer placed a hand gently on her shoulder, signaling that the time had come to step away with dignity and tact, but Denise held her stare one moment longer, making sure the agent knew this was not a wound she could cover with policy making, sure the crowd knew the story was finished on her terms. Then finally she turned and stepped back beside the lawyer, the whispers following her, not with ridicule but with awe. Her walk back from the counter was slow, deliberate, each step carrying the weight of victory. Though justice was still to come in full measure, the crowd parted for her now, some bowing their heads slightly, some whispering blessings, some simply watching with wide eyes, as if unable to fully grasp what they had just witnessed. Her heart thudded heavily in her chest, but she did not falter. She knew she had faced the storm and returned with something greater than she had lost. She knew the stare had ended, not with her defeat, but with her restoration, justice in the air. The silence that followed Denise as she stepped back from the counter was unlike the silence that had come before. Earlier, it had been heavy with mockery and disbelief, but now it was heavy with respect and recognition. The crowd that once whispered behind her back now whispered about her with awe, and the gate agent who had once torn her ticket with smug power now sat frozen, pale and uncertain, with the weight of her choices pressing down on her shoulders. Denise walked slowly, each step echoing louder than any word spoken, her head high, her body steady, her son's face flashing in her memory, reminding her of the promise she had made to him and to herself, that she would never let the world decide her worth. The lawyer beside her walked with quiet confidence, his presence a shield and a torch at the same time. He spoke softly, telling her that official calls had already been placed, that documents were moving, that what had happened here today would not vanish into the air but would be carried forward into consequence. Denise nodded, not needing every detail but trusting the strength in his tone and the certainty in his eyes. She knew now that she was not standing alone. Her voice had joined with others who could carry it into spaces she had never thought she would reach. The boy with the phone lifted it again, capturing her walk away from the gate, his friend whispering that this moment looked like victory, that it looked like justice unfolding in real time. The crowd parted like water before her, some smiling softly, some bowing their heads, others reaching out to touch her arm, lightly as if to lend her strength or to take some for themselves. A woman in a red coat who had earlier whispered cruelty now lowered her gaze, her face flushed with shame, while another woman leaned forward and whispered to Denise that she was proud of her, though they had never met. Denise gave her a small nod, her eyes shining not with tears but with the glow of dignity restored. When she reached the waiting area just beyond the line, the announcements overhead called again for boarding of first class and business passengers, but no one moved. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen to her. They knew instinctively this story was not finished until justice was seen, not just promised. The lawyer turned to the gate agent, his voice calm but edged with steel, telling her to restore the ticket immediately or to prepare for formal charges. The agent stammered, her face paling further as she typed reluctantly, her fingers clumsy on the keys, until finally she printed a new boarding pass, sliding it across the counter with trembling hands. The lawyer took the boarding pass but did not hand it to Denise. Right away he raised it in the air so the crowd could see it and spoke loud enough for all to hear, saying that this pass was more than paper, it was proof that dignity could not be torn away and discarded like trash. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some clapping softly, some saying amen under their breath, and the agent sank deeper into her chair as though wishing the ground would swallow her. Denise stepped forward and took the boarding pass in her hand, her fingers closing around it, not with desperation but with calm, steady strength. She turned then to the crowd, her voice soft yet clear, saying thank you, not to those who had mocked her, but to those who had silently stood with her, even in their fear. She said she hoped no one would ever forget that dignity, once stolen, could always be restored. When truth stepped into the light, her words were not long, but they carried weight, and the crowd received them in silence, a silence filled, not with judgment, but with reverence. The lawyer guided her toward the gate, and this time the crowd did not watch her as a spectacle, but as a figure walking into her rightful place. The boy recording lowered his phone at last, whispering that he had captured everything, but for once, he did not feel like just a witness to entertainment. He felt like a witness to history unfolding. The man in the grey suit who had laughed before now looked at her with regret, though his apology never reached his lips. The mother with the child lifted her daughter onto her lap, whispering, that this was what courage looked like, and the child nodded, her wide eyes fixed on Denise, as if she were a hero, stepping into a story that would be told again and again. When Denise handed the boarding pass at the gate, the attendant there did not dare question her. The pass scanned with a soft chime, and she walked down the jet bridge, her footsteps echoing in the tunnel. The air smelled of metal and fabric, and something inside her eased with every step, as if she was shedding the weight of shame with every forward motion. She entered the cabin of the plane, where first-class seats gleamed with polished leather and soft light, and though eyes turned to look at her again, she no longer felt small beneath them. She walked with calm grace, found her seat, and sat down with dignity intact. The lawyer lingered behind to handle the remaining matters, but before she lost sight of him, he gave her a nod, a promise that this story would not fade away into silence. He would carry it further, into offices and courtrooms if needed, and Denise knew she could trust that. She leaned back into her seat, her heart still pounding, but now with relief and quiet triumph. The flight attendants moved about, preparing for takeoff, some casting her small glances, their eyes filled with questions, but none dared to speak. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to move, Denise closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of her son at home, who would one day hear about this day in full detail. She thought of her mother, who had fought her whole life for dignity, who now seemed to be watching from beyond, proud of the daughter who had stood tall when the world tried to crush her. She thought of every laugh that had cut her down, every door that had been slammed, and she thought of how all of it had led her here to this seat, reclaimed not by luck but by strength and truth. The plane lifted from the ground, breaking through clouds into open sky, and Denise felt something in her chest rise with it. She was no longer just a mother traveling on a ticket. She was a woman who had faced humiliation and turned it into fire, who had been pushed down and had risen higher than before. She was proof to herself, to her son, to the strangers who had watched, that no one could decide her worth for her ever again. And as the city lights shrank below and the vast sky stretched out ahead, she whispered softly, a promise that she would carry this strength forward, always, no matter what battles came next, because she knew now without question that dignity, once reclaimed, could never be taken again. The end.